What's good, everyone? Today we're covering the story of a man who gets reincarnated as the father of a future villain in an Otome game. His daughter is locked into a path of ruin. And knowing that, he makes a decision he's going to be the loving father and husband he never managed to be the first time around. That's our premise. Let's get into it. When he opened his eyes, the protagonist was staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling. He looked down at his hands, confused about why he was even lying in bed, and grabbed his head trying to make sense of the situation. That's when a woman's voice broke the silence, soft, timid, asking if he was all right. She was sitting right there in front of him with tears threatening to spill over. When he tried to sit up, he didn't even register at first that she was speaking to him. She panicked immediately and told him he shouldn't get up yet. He brushed her off and said he was fine. But then his own voice threw him. It was deep, rough, and far too mature to belong to the person he remembered being. He reached up and touched his face, ran a hand through dark brown hair, and the pieces clicked into place. He'd been reborn in someone else's body entirely. The woman beside him looked absolutely terrified. His name, as it turned out, was Karis Foe, head of a ducal house. The frightened woman sitting in front of him was his wife, Duchess Sasha Foe. Together, they had a daughter named Laurier, a family of 3. He began to understand that this was a life he had never actually lived, because in his previous existence he'd been a perfectly ordinary salaryman in Japan, a world where aristocracy was a thing you read about in history books. He'd grown up there, gotten a boring office job, had a name he could barely pull from the fog of his memory. He clutched his head and gave up trying to remember it, but one memory came through sharp and clean. Pure Love Princess, your super flirty romance, a dating simulator for girls, an Otome game, of all the things to surface first. It was that he stared into space trying to drag up something more useful. Sasha sat stiffly beside him and tried again to ask how he was feeling. He told her he was fine, and called her by name. She snapped to attention alarmed and asked what had happened. The name had just slipped out without thinking. Based on everything churning in his head, he knew without doubt this woman was his wife. But 2 lifetimes of memories were crammed into one skull, and it made everything feel tangled and unstable. He sat up on the edge of the bed and told himself he needed to sort this out. The body belonged to Karis, but the mind was still very much Japanese. When you stacked all of that together, only one explanation held up, delusional as it sounded. Reincarnation into another world. The classic setup: an ordinary office worker wakes up inside the body of a handsome aristocrat. Naturally, once his head cleared, something else clicked into place. He finally understood why Sasha had been sitting there like she was bracing for something awful. He'd assumed she was just worried about his health. But the memories of the former Karis painted a very different picture. Their relationship had been cold, to put it mildly. The original Karis hadn't shown Sasha even a sliver of genuine interest, so when she stood up and quietly asked if she should call a doctor, he told her there was no need. He asked if he had lost consciousness. She told him what the doctor had said: severe exhaustion. Nothing serious, and then added, almost apologetically, whether she was bothering him. Her eyes were filling up again. Instead of dismissing her, Karis reached out and slowly stroked her hair. He thanked her for staying with him. He told her he was glad she was his wife. Sasha froze. Her mouth fell open a little. She'd never heard anything like that from him. Not once. Out of reflex, she tried to deflect with excuses, and Karis found that strange. Even couples who didn't get along could still treat each other with basic decency. A smile spread across his face. Then he thought about it and almost laughed at himself. Of course she reacted that way. A husband who used to look right through her suddenly turning warm out of nowhere, that would throw anyone off. The rift had been born from the original Karis's coldness toward women in general, but as far as the new Karis was concerned, being married meant something. He owed it to this family, to Sasha, to Laurier, to make amends for the years that had been wasted. He turned back to her, stroked her hair again, and apologized for making her worry. She asked, bewildered, if he was really feeling all right. He replied, a little amused, asking why she immediately assumed something was wrong. He knew the answer. But even so, he left the room because there was someone else he needed to check on urgently. His memories of Laurier were blurry at best, but he knew they had a daughter who was about to turn 4. Out in the hallway, he was met by an elderly servant named C, who had been on his way to check on the master himself. C looked surprised to find Karis walking around already. He asked where he was headed. Karis told him he was going to look in on Laurier. C blinked, asked him to say that again. Karis told him his ears hadn't deceived him, scratched the back of his head awkwardly, and asked which wing his daughter's room was in. C pointed him toward a large, pale-colored door, though not without gently mentioning that young Miss Laurier was currently in the middle of an etiquette lesson. Karis thanked him and said he'd just peek in. C looked uncertain, but let him pass. Karis paused in front of the door, preparing to knock. Then he heard it, screaming, not stern, not firm, vicious. A woman's voice tearing into a child. She called Laurier worthless, stupid, said her parents were just as worthless, said no one would ever want her. Karis's eyes went wide, his body locked up. The little girl behind that door was sobbing. apologizing over and over, and through her tears she said something that cut straight through him. She thought her parents had grown cold toward each other because of her, that it was her fault. Karis grabbed his head. She came up behind him, trying to get through to him, but the woman's voice kept going, telling Laurier that deep down she already knew her parents didn't love her. And Laurier, crying hard now, said that at least he should have loved her. Karis tensed. He remembered, and then he kicked the door open. Arms out, voice raised. He came in swinging, confronting the woman directly and demanding to know what she was doing to his daughter. Laurier threw her hands over her face. The teacher spun around in horror. She hadn't expected the father to come running at all. Karis pointed straight at her and asked again, what was she doing to his child? The teacher scrambled to pull herself together and claimed she was simply conducting an etiquette lesson. Karis's eyes moved to Laurier's arms. He saw bruises. He asked where they came from. The teacher stumbled out a ridiculous excuse about the young lady tripping and falling. That was all he needed. He fired her on the spot. She tried to defend herself, said her methods were for Laurier's benefit. That being strict was her duty. Karis told her to shut up. He told her his household didn't need to keep a talentless tutor, and warned her to stay far away from his family, or there'd be consequences. 2 maids appeared and escorted the woman out. He told C to make sure she never came back to the estate. Then he rushed over to Laurier. He crouched down and asked if she was all right. He pulled her into a hug and apologized genuinely, painfully, for being a terrible father, for letting her go through all of this without anyone noticing. The girl was stunned by him. He told her everything was going to be different now. She sobbed into his shoulder that she'd been told nobody needed her, that she was bad, and then she threw herself fully into his arms and wept. He carried her to her room and laid her down to rest, sitting by her bed. He turned it all over in his mind. He was furious at that tutor. But more than anything, he was furious at himself. At the Karis who had been so blind to what was happening right under his own roof, he couldn't wrap his head around it. How could any person treat their own family with that kind of utter disregard? That's when Sasha walked in, took one look at Laurier's bruises, and immediately blamed herself. She said she'd been too caught up in her own heartache, too desperate for Karis's attention, and had completely forgotten about their daughter in the process. Karis put an arm around her shoulders and told her gently that the fault was his. He was the one who'd shut them both out from the start. Their marriage had always felt like a transaction, a political arrangement, and he'd let that coldness seep into everything around him. But today, he said, he'd finally seen how foolish he'd been. He asked Sasha to give him a chance to start over, acknowledged how self-serving the request sounded, but asked her to let them build something together for Laurier's sake, so none of this would ever happen again. He got down on one knee and took her hands. He looked her in the eye and said that as a man, more than anything, he wanted to be her anchor, to share every joy and every burden equally from here on, because he loved her more than life itself. A warm smile appeared on his face, and the tears in Sasha's eyes shifted from sorrow to something else entirely. He stood up, pulled her close, and told her to let him carry this with her. She told him she loved him very much. They were about to kiss when C, without knocking, walked right into the room. He immediately read the atmosphere, suggested he come back later, and Karis waved him out into the hallway. Out in the hall, C tried to bring up finding a replacement for the etiquette tutor, but Karis stopped him. He asked if C had known what the woman was doing to Laurier. C lowered his eyes and said he'd suspected as much. Karis demanded to know why he hadn't said anything. C told him he'd tried. More than once, but every time Laurier's name came up, the former Karis had flatly refused to listen, and then C added something that hit even harder. Laurier herself had begged him to stay quiet. She was scared of becoming a burden. Karis stood there absorbing that. A child that young, already training herself not to cause trouble for anyone. He asked if any of the other teachers had behaved the same way. C said he didn't believe so, and handed him a full list of the household staff. Karis looked it over carefully, then ordered C to report to him immediately if any of them turned out to be cut from the same cloth. As for the new etiquette tutor, he'd make that selection himself. C bowed, then told him he'd pushed all of the master's non-urgent matters to the following day. He advised Karis to spend the rest of today with his wife and daughter. Karis thanked him and told him he'd been a great help. C replied that this was the greatest honor he'd ever had in serving the man. Karis went back to the room. Laurier had just opened her eyes and was trying to say something. Both parents rushed to her side at once. Karis asked her how she was feeling, told her she could rest today if she wanted. Laurier sat up and asked about her lessons. Her father stroked her head and told her to forget about that for now. Then, more importantly, he told her, if anyone ever hurt her again, she wasn't to hide it from them. The girl hung her head and started to stutter. Her teacher had told her not to bother them, that they were very busy, that she'd only get in the way. Karis made her look at him. He told her clearly and calmly. She was their treasure. She would never be a burden. He told her she was allowed to rely on her parents from now on, to ask them for anything she wanted. But Laurier still couldn't quite get herself to believe it. She started crying again, the teacher's words still looping in her head. Kara said they needed her more than she knew because they were a family. He looked at Sasha and asked her to say something to back him up. Sasha pulled Laurier into a tight hug and apologized for how long she hadn't noticed her pain. It was overdue, she said, but she meant every word. Laurier was precious to her. Laurier pulled back and looked at her mother's face and asked if that was really true. Sasha told her yes. She was their beloved daughter, their treasure, their whole world. Laurier burst into tears again, but this time the weight of them was different. Curris watched them hold each other and stayed quiet for a moment. Not long ago he hadn't had a wife or a daughter, not in any real sense. He'd never known what paternal feeling even felt like. But he was surprised by how naturally he'd slipped into it, like something that had been buried underneath the original Karis the entire time. Maybe it had been. He turned to both of them and made a small suggestion. Shared dinners. Starting tomorrow, the three of them would sit down and eat together every evening, building their relationship back piece by piece, starting with the small things. Sasha said it sounded wonderful. Laurier's whole face lit up. She said she'd be looking forward to it very, very much. Then she went quiet and embarrassed. Karis told her she didn't have to be shy, to just say what she wanted. She grabbed the edge of the bed, fidgeted, then looked up at both her parents and asked very quietly, expecting to be told no if she could sleep with them tonight. They both said yes, without hesitation. The girl went from bracing herself to absolutely overjoyed in the span of a second. She asked them to read her a story, and Sasha promised they would. Laurier ran off to get changed for bed. Karis watched her go and thought, the past couldn't be rewritten, but from today they could start writing something new. A clean page for all of them. I want to take a second here because this opening chapter did something I didn't expect. Going in, I figured this would be your standard warm and fuzzy isekai setup. Wholesome moments, quick emotional payoffs, nothing that really digs under your skin. And look, the emotional beats do hit fast. But what actually got me was that throwaway detail about Laurier begging C not to say anything. She didn't want anyone to know she was being abused because she was terrified of being a burden. That's not manga drama for shock value. That's a really specific and accurate portrait of how children in neglected homes learn to disappear. The mangaka understood exactly how a child raised in emotional coldness would internalize the blame, and they slipped that in quietly without making a big show of it. That one line did more work than a dozen tearful confrontation scenes ever could have. I'm genuinely invested now. Time passed. After spending the last few days with his family and settling into his new body, Karis couldn't shake a strange feeling, some nagging premonition he couldn't quite put his finger on. Every time he looked at Laurier, something tightened in his chest. He sat in his study and turned it over. The ducal house of Ho aristocratic titles, it all swirled around his head like mismatched clues, his 2 lifetimes of memories jumbled together into a foggy mess. Then something surfaced. Laurier, he'd heard that name before, not here. Not in this world. He'd heard it in Japan, a world where there was no such thing as nobility. He didn't know why it set off alarm bells, but if he just dug a little deeper, he was certain he'd unearthed something terrible. He thought about Laurier's words, how she'd said that no one loved her anyway, and then it hit him all at once. He hadn't wanted to believe it. Laurier was the villain, pure love princess, your super flirty romance, the otome game that had been the very first thing to surface from his Japanese memory. In that past life in Japan, games like this were everywhere, dating simulators for girls, stories of romance and heartbreak in aristocratic settings, and in one of those games, there had been a villain, a proud, scheming girl who made life hell for the main heroine and stood in the way of her love at every turn. That villain's name had been Laurier Foe. Karis refused to believe it. Coincidences like that just didn't happen, and yet he was apparently the father of that very same villain. He tried to comfort himself with the idea that it could just be a similar world. He immediately dismissed that idea. You don't land in a world this similar by accident. He'd read manga about heroines reincarnated as villains, working to break the flags of doom and rewrite their fates. He guessed something in that neighborhood must have happened to him. And to be fair, having memories from a past life at all was already wild enough. He didn't need to go adding more layers on top of it. But if this was really the case, his Laurier was headed somewhere dark. He could not accept that the sweet little angel he just watched run off to get changed for bed would someday turn into a villain still. God helps those who help themselves. Better to nip the risk factors early. He sat there sifting through what he could remember of the game's plot, a classic fairy tale, more or less a love story between an aristocratic prince and a commoner girl. Laurier enters as the villain, trying to sabotage the main heroine's relationship with the handsome prince. Karis thought back there was something about a stepbrother route, but since the family didn't have any adopted children at the moment, he could shelve that worry for now. The main headache was the prince's route. He seemed to recall there being a prince around Laurier's age in the royal family, but given the number of influential noble houses in the picture, the odds of an engagement being floated anytime soon felt slim. He wasn't going to spiral over that just yet. The real tripwire was simple. If Laurier fell head over heels in love with that prince herself, things could go sideways fast. Karis didn't know how a girl could fall for someone she'd never even met, but in the game, that was exactly what had happened. Laurier had been completely consumed by her feelings for the prince, and out of blinding jealousy she'd gone out of her way to humiliate the heroine at every turn. Those outbursts only ended up driving the heroine and prince closer together. In the end, all of Laurier's schemes were exposed. A predictable bad ending. The highlight of that route, the one shown off as its defining scene, was a very public breaking of the engagement. The game itself had kept the aftermath off-screen, but the official art book hadn't been as kind. After being cast out, Laurier had wandered the streets alone until she crossed paths with the wrong people in a back alley. And that was where her story ended. Karis was outraged by that. What a cruel and undeserved fate. But even if things somehow spiraled to that worst-case scenario, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never kick Laurier out of his house. Never. Not for any reason. He thought about it more carefully. Laurier, in his honest opinion, wasn't truly to blame for how the game played out. Yes, she went overboard, but what girl wouldn't lose her composure if some upstart girl suddenly started getting cozy with her fiancé? The real problem, as he saw it, was the prince. If the man was the kind of person who'd start chasing after another woman right in front of his fiancé, then Karis wanted nothing to do with him, and his daughter certainly wasn't going to end up with someone like that. But if Laurier genuinely fell in love, there was nothing he could do to stop that. He'd do everything in his power to make sure her feelings were returned. And if the prince started eyeing the heroine, Karis would simply maneuver Laurier into dumping him first. But none of that was the most important thing. The most important thing was this. Laurier had grown up in a cold household. That's what had made her desperate, clingy, willing to do anything for a scrap of affection from someone who never deserved her. She'd smothered the prince with her attachment, driven herself mad with jealousy, and brought about her own ruin. There was only one real solution. Karis had to pour everything he had into this family and love them so completely and so genuinely that Laurier would never need to go looking for that kind of validation elsewhere. Simple, genius, even for his wife's happiness, for his daughter's happiness, for the peace of their home. Karis was ready to give them everything, and he was not going to let that bad ending happen. Not on his watch, which brought him to the kitchen, where this goal was apparently going to be pursued through baking. He'd already cursed himself 6 times over the limited selection of ingredients this world had to offer. Sugar was essentially a luxury item here. The scale was clunky and inconvenient, and there wasn't a proper cookie cutter to be found anywhere. But he had managed, through sheer stubbornness, to press out cookies shaped vaguely like seals. He picked one up and inspected it. Far from perfect, but by local standards, honestly decent. He tasted one, actually delicious. So why had Karis suddenly taken up baking? Because he wanted to treat his girls to something sweet. That was all. When little Laurier tried one of the cookies, her face lit up. She asked her father if he'd really made them himself, barely able to believe it. Sasha, absolutely delighted, called them incredible. Comparing these to what he remembered from his past life, Karis came to one honest conclusion. Getting quality ingredients in this world was a genuine undertaking. No nuts. No cocoa. Just these strange local varieties of snowball biscuits and plain shortbread. Getting creative with recipes was going to be limited. He'd decided at least to give the cookies a cute shape, and in the kitchen he'd found something that worked as a cat-shaped cutter. He'll be the first to admit that a full-grown man carefully stamping tiny cat faces into dough felt a little absurd. But for the people he cared about, he'd endure worse than that. Just then, the head chef, a broad-shouldered, bearded man named Garlic, tall chef's hat and all, came into the kitchen. He asked if Mr. Karis had finished up, and Karis told him everything was just about ready. Garlic looked at the results and remarked that they were beautifully done. He was genuinely surprised and asked when Karis had learned to cook like this. Karis said he'd just practiced in his spare time, then offered Garlic a taste. The chef didn't decline. He took a bite, and then his face did something very strange. It went completely blank. Karis was honestly scared for a second. Then Garlic grabbed his arm and basically begged for the recipe. Karis said he'd be happy to share it, and asked how they tasted. Garlic said, still wearing that same unreadable expression, that they were simply divine. He tried to explain the texture was unlike anything he'd encountered before. They were so light and crisp that the moment they hit your tongue they practically dissolved, and the flavor underneath was extraordinary. He asked, still in shock, how Karis had managed it. Karis still hadn't fully solved the mystery of Garlic's face. He decided it must be the love he'd baked into them and left it at that. Garlic smiled at that and admitted the rumors going around the estate were apparently true, that Mr. Karis seemed like a completely different person lately. More relaxed, even joking around. Karis let out a surprised laugh and immediately had a good guess at what exactly was circulating. He knew it was the absolute truth, so he couldn't exactly argue with it. Garlic apologized in advance for being presumptuous, but said the atmosphere in the whole mansion had shifted noticeably in recent days, and he wasn't wrong. Before, when the relationship between Karis, Sasha, and Laurier had been a quiet disaster, the tension bled into everything. It had been hard for even the servants to breathe, but ever since a new man had woken up in the old Karis's body, he'd started treating the staff with a kind of natural, uncomplicated warmth that none of them were prepared for. People started to relax. Garlic, for instance, had nearly jumped out of his skin the first time the master wandered into the kitchen. But now the staff looked at this family and smiled. The biggest reason everything felt lighter, though, was simpler than any of that. It was watching Karis treat his wife and daughter with genuine tenderness. Something that had been completely invisible before. Karis told Garlic he had a request. A special dish he wanted prepared. Garlic said he'd be more than happy to handle it and reminded Karis not to forget to write out that cookie recipe for him. Karis laughed at how he wasn't about to let that slip through his fingers. He told Garlic he'd write it out for him later, then left the kitchen to go invite his ladies to tea. He was stopped almost immediately by one of the maids, who told him apologetically that the young lady was currently in the middle of dance class. Karis looked at her in surprise. Right, dance lessons are non-negotiable for aristocratic children. Nothing to be done about it. That didn't stop him from finding it faintly outrageous that his daughter was out there toiling on a dance floor at her age. He asked the maid if Laurier had any more lessons after that. She said no, just the dance class today, and asked why he wanted to know. He asked her to pass along a message. Once Laurier was done, the family would be having tea in the courtyard. The maid smiled and said the young lady would be very pleased to hear it. Thinking about that maid made Karis pause. She was genuinely fond of Laurier, the affection was real. After the incident with the governess, he'd gone through the entire household and dismissed everyone whose behavior echoed what had happened. He'd rebuilt the whole environment around his daughter from scratch, and servants who truly cared about the people they worked for, in Karis's view, were worth more than their weight in gold. Those were the people who needed to be kept close. He left that task with her and went to find his second lady. He walked into Sasha's room with a smile and an apology for arriving unannounced and stopped. In front of him was a woman so beautiful, it could knock you off balance. She was seated at a table, completely absorbed in whatever she was doing, and hadn't even heard him come in. Karis looked at her and thought that this was the kind of face someone could just sit and admire indefinitely. He reminded himself they had plans and spoke up. Sasha, startled, apologized for not noticing him, and explained she'd gotten too wrapped up in her work. He apologized right back for walking in without knocking. The maids had told him she'd be here doing embroidery, which is why he'd come. He moved closer and reached out to take a strand of her hair between his fingers. He told her he'd been so taken by the sight of her that speech had temporarily failed him. Sasha turned red and said he was flattering her. But standing that close to her, Karis felt it. He was genuinely ready to embarrass himself with a silly grin. He asked her gently what she'd been working so hard on and looked at the table. There was an embroidery hoop with fabric stretched across it, covered in a delicate flower pattern. He told her it was beautiful. Sasha turned an even deeper shade of red and admitted, quietly, and a little afraid, that she'd been making it for him. She asked if that would cause him any inconvenience. Karis put a hand under her chin and tilted her face toward him. What inconvenience could there possibly be? He told her he was completely overjoyed to receive something made by his wife's own hands, and looked at her with more warmth than she clearly knew what to do with. Her cheeks went full burgundy. She asked what had actually brought him to her room, and he remembered why he'd come. He told her his idea. The three of them should have tea together once Laurier finished dancing. Would she like that? She smiled at him and said she'd love nothing more. He thought about the fact that they still had some time and asked if he could sit with her and watch her embroider until Laurier was free. Sasha smiled sweetly and gave her permission. Karis made a note to himself that it was fortunate this was the middle of the afternoon, because if it had been evening things might have gone too far. He leaned towards Sasha and whispered that he'd love to run his hand through her hair too, but he'd wait until they were alone. She immediately turned scarlet. He laughed at her. Laurier grinned. Karis scooped her up cheerfully and invited everyone to sit down and start on the tea. The girl was thrilled. When they settled at the table, Sasha and Laurier's mouths fell open. The table was covered in cookies and other treats. Karis explained he decided to try his hand at baking. He asked his two ladies to taste and give him their verdict. Sasha asked in disbelief if he'd really made all of this himself. He confirmed it. He'd baked them with love specifically for the two of them, and he hoped they liked them. He mentioned he'd made Laurier's a bit sweeter and tried to keep Sasha's batch a little more delicate in flavor. His wife said she couldn't believe he'd gone to all that trouble just for them. He told her it was a pleasure. He just wanted to treat them to something good. Sasha wanted to thank him and Laurier did too, but Karis told them to at least try the cookies first before the talking. They started eating. Karis held his breath, wanting them to be perfect, willing the family to like them. Laurier declared them sweet and very tasty. Sasha said with a smile that they melted on her tongue. He picked up his tea, took a sip, and let out a long breath of relief, genuinely happy. Sasha asked if he was going to have any himself. He said seeing how much they were enjoying them was enough for him. Sasha and Laurier exchanged a look. They'd figured something out. His daughter picked up a cookie, pointed it at his mouth, and asked him to open up. Karis's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't expected his own daughter to feed him from her hand. Then Sasha did the same thing, held out a cookie, and asked her husband to eat. His heart pounded even harder. He had never been so grateful to be Karis in this body. He told the ladies he'd gladly accept their offering. He ate the 2 cookies and was absolutely delighted. His daughter asked if he liked them, and he said they were simply overflowing with love. Sasha and Laurier smiled at each other, pleased that they'd made the head of the household happy. Then the girl started giggling and covered her face with both hands out of embarrassment. Sasha asked what was wrong, and Laurier said honestly from somewhere very pure that eating delicious things together was just so much joy. Both parents told her in unison that it really was. Karis suggested they bake cookies together next time. Sasha said she'd love that. Laurier waved her arms in excitement, and then they just sat together, talking and laughing and drinking tea and eating every last one. From now on, Karis thought, to make sure those smiles never faded, he was ready to give them even more. Okay, here's where I actually need to give the story some credit, because this chapter is doing something kind of clever that I didn't notice at first. Karis's whole strategy for preventing the bad ending isn't some grand chess game or political maneuvering. It's cookies, it's tea parties, it's sitting in a room watching your wife embroider. And the manga is very deliberate about this. The reason Game Laurier became a villain wasn't some inherent evil in her. It was that she grew up starved for love and latched onto the first person who showed her any. So the fix isn't complicated, it's just showing up, consistently, with warmth. And I think that's genuinely smart writing. Not in a wow this is deep way, but in a this is actually how real damage gets undone way. It earned that cookie scene for me. Little Laurier Foe and her father Karis rode through the streets in a large carriage, seated on plush leather. Laurier stared out at nothing, worry written all over her face. Karis told her everything was going to be fine and that she just had to be herself, but the girl replied that this was her very first time going to the palace. He smiled and silently acknowledged that telling a 4-year-old not to worry was probably not his most useful parenting instinct. Here was the situation. The palace was hosting a birthday celebration for Princess Serena, the kingdom's second princess. Typically, aristocratic children made their social debut shortly after turning 5. But this gathering was a special exception. Only young ladies the same age as the princess were invited, accompanied by their parents. For the royal family, the occasion was a chance to find real companions for Serena. For the nobility, it was a networking opportunity. A daughter who found favor with the princess was a daughter with a future at court. And if a family happened to have sons, well, the possibilities were even more interesting. Karis was quietly hoping Laurier would just have fun and not spend the whole time thinking about any of that. He turned to her and told her if she remembered her lessons and behaved like herself, everything would go beautifully. But Laurier replied with a very serious face that as the daughter of the ducal house of Faux, she had to be absolutely impeccable. Karis stared at her for a moment. She wasn't even 5 yet, and she was talking like a diplomat. He told her gently that she really didn't need to put that kind of pressure on herself. He asked her to try to befriend Princess Serena, but added immediately, if for whatever reason that didn't happen, simply greeting her politely would be more than enough. Family status was important. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but the most important thing, in his opinion, was for Laurier to stay true to who she was. The girl clenched her fists and fidgeted with the folds of her dress. He continued speaking softly, telling her there was no greater joy for him than seeing her remain the kind and sensitive girl she'd always been. He stroked her shoulders. He glanced at her and privately thought, what a lovely daughter I have. Karis was aware that as head of the ducal house, he was probably supposed to be playing a more aggressive political game, but he couldn't bring himself to reduce everything to politics. Yes, the continuation of his aristocratic line mattered. It was one of the realities of this world, but what he was actually building toward was security for Laurier and any future children he and Sasha might have. Above all, he wanted his family to be happy. In high society where your connections were everything, some amount of navigating unpleasant personalities was unavoidable. His fatherly heart, though, strongly objected to Laurier ever having to force herself. She needed experience, he understood that, but he'd rather there be as few of those forced moments as possible. Laurier shouldn't have to swallow her own feelings for the sake of the family name. She'd already been doing that alone for far too long. He sat beside her, stroking her head, and told her. She was a very kind and very smart girl, and that's why she kept so much to herself. But she could safely lean on him and her mother now. Laurier picked at her dress again, and said quietly that he and her mother were already so busy. He had only one thought in response to that. Finding time for your child is every parent's sacred duty. He looked at her with gentle eyes and told her she was the most precious daughter he and Sasha had. He took her hands and promised not to let go until they reached the hall, so she didn't have to worry anymore. She looked up at her father with total trust and calmed down. She said his hand was very large and reassuring. He was slightly surprised by that and laughed, and they rode on. When they entered the royal garden, the reception was polite but cool, and visibly surprised. Duke Fo was not exactly known for attending events like this. His presence was so unusual that the guests had to piece it together. That must be his daughter standing beside him. Karis knew the unspoken rules of high society cold. Speaking first to someone of higher rank was considered bad form. You stayed silent until addressed. Karis found this completely backward from what he'd grown up with in Japan, where the person of lower status always greeted first, introduced themselves, and bowed. But whatever his personal feelings, he had a reputation to uphold, the reputation of a man who had lived his entire life as a proper aristocrat. For Sasha and Laurier's sake, he set aside every instinct and played the role flawlessly. He walked through the garden at his daughter's side, greeting each guest warmly and openly. Laurier followed his lead, curtsying, introducing herself as Laurier Fo, meeting each person with composure. Karis noticed that she was a little shy of all the formal attention, but she was handling herself brilliantly. For a girl who'd had the misfortune of an absolutely dreadful etiquette tutor, she had an almost natural talent for this. She thanked people, respected them, never dropped her dignity for a second. Laurier was barely 4 years old, and she was already carrying herself like a true duke's daughter. Karis was completely speechless. His heart said, "This child is an angel." His mouth said nothing, but his eyes couldn't help themselves. An announcement went through the garden. His Majesty, the King, and second Princess Serena had arrived. Every servant and guest present bowed in unison. The king addressed the gathered crowd, thanked them for accepting the invitation, and offered his sincere wishes for a wonderful evening in honor of Serena's birthday applause. And then he approached and addressed Duke Fo directly. The king said he was pleased to see him there. Karis replied he was glad to make his acquaintance and recalled the small internal note he'd made to himself earlier. That status wasn't everything to him personally. Even if his family sat at the very top of the aristocratic hierarchy, he introduced himself to Princess Serena with genuine respect and offered her a sincere holiday greeting. The girl thanked Duke Fo. Karis then asked the king and princess for permission to introduce his daughter, his precious beloved Laurier. Laurier stepped forward, gave a graceful curtsy, and thanked them for the invitation. Karis watched in secret delight. That delivery, the curtsy, the words was absolutely perfect. Then the king made a slightly displeased face. Karis noticed immediately and asked if everything was all right. The king, with a faint smile that carried something like disbelief, said he was not displeased so much as surprised by the unmistakable tenderness with which Duke Fo was looking at his daughter. He hoped Karis wouldn't take that as a lack of tact, but he had never once had the impression that the man cared about his family at all. Karis inwardly acknowledged that even the king had known about the old Karis's coldness. He answered honestly. He should be burning with shame, because that had indeed been the case before. But now he loved his daughter with everything he had, and that applied fully to his wife as well. They were his most beloved people. The king looked surprised. He said he hoped Laurier and Princess Serena would find their way to becoming friends, and he was counting on the young lady. Laurier was delighted. His Majesty and the princess made to leave, mentioning they'd speak with Fo a bit later. But then Serena turned around and ran back to Laurier. The two girls took each other's hands and smiled. Serena invited Laurier to have tea with her sometime. Laurier flushed with excitement, but said yes. Then Serena glanced briefly over at Karis. Their eyes met, and something about it made him uneasy. The king called his daughter over, and just like that, they were gone. The girl asked her father nervously if she'd done the greetings correctly. She was clutching her dress again. Karis leaned down, patted her on the head, and told her she'd done a wonderful job. He promised that when they got home, he'd make her something very tasty as a reward. Laurier beamed. He took her hand and told her they didn't have much further to go, and after a while they returned home. Laurier was barely through the door before she was running toward Sasha. Calling out to her mother that they were back and throwing herself into her arms, Karis thanked his wife warmly for always being there to greet them. He said her smile was the first thing he saw coming home, and that it gave him strength every single time. Sasha replied with tears of happiness that she was the lucky one, being able to greet them like this every day. Karis said how good it was to hear that, and privately thought his wife was an absolute angel. Laurier gently reminded her father about the promised treat. He told her he hadn't forgotten and to wait just a moment, then headed for the kitchen. Sasha followed with a concerned look and asked if he was really planning to start cooking right now, having just come back from a royal celebration. He picked Laurier up, said this was a well-deserved reward for his daughter, and that it brought him joy, then winked at his wife. She smiled sweetly in return. He promised that once the dessert was ready, all three of them would have tea together, and he had plenty to tell Sasha about what a wonderful little lady Laurier had been today. The girl was nearly glowing. He went to the kitchen with a purpose. He needed something quick and light, no keeping his girls waiting. He settled on a recipe he'd been wanting to try. He took out a bowl and a whisk, mixed the prepared ingredients, then layered the cookies from his previous batch into a baking dish and poured the mixture over them into the oven. Once it had cooled and been arranged on a dish, it was done. He considered it a genuinely solid recipe. He would have loved to work with finer ingredients, but there was nothing to be done about that. He had to experiment with what this world offered and make the best of it. So he walked in just then, noticed the master was in the kitchen again, and remarked with mild astonishment that he'd barely just returned and had already started cooking. Karis admitted he'd gotten a little carried away with his emotions. C laughed quietly and said it shouldn't surprise him anymore. The kitchen had practically become Mr. Karis's second study at this point. Then C mentioned he had something urgent to discuss. Karis asked him to go ahead, and C produced a letter. An invitation had arrived for the young lady Laurier from Princess Serena herself. Karis asked C to repeat that. The seal was undeniably from the royal family, addressed directly to Laurier. Karis found it striking that it had arrived so quickly, essentially immediately after the reception. That level of efficiency made him wonder if it had been planned in advance, or if he was just being paranoid. C asked anxiously how to proceed. Karis replied seriously. He would speak with Laurier personally. If she flatly didn't want to go, he'd fight tooth and nail and decline. Though he acknowledged to himself quietly that refusing a direct personal invitation from a princess was basically impossible in practical terms. But the most important thing first was to know what Laurier actually wanted. I'll be real with you, I was waiting for this to get complicated in a bad way. You introduce a villain route, a prince, a heroine, and suddenly you've got all the ingredients for the kind of story where the dad becomes a puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes and everything feels manufactured. But this chapter actually sold me on Karis's approach. He's not trying to eliminate the game's plot. He's not plotting against the prince or the heroine. He genuinely just wants Laurier to grow up secure enough that she doesn't need to be the villain in the first place. That's the whole strategy. And what I find interesting is that it comes from a place of actual empathy for Game Laurier too. He feels sorry for the version of her that had nobody. That's the kind of nuance I didn't expect this early, and I respect it. A short while later, Karis and Laurier gathered at the table. Karis apologized to his ladies for making them wait. Laurier immediately asked about the dessert. Sasha apologized too, saying her husband always took on so much and looking a little restless. He replied calmly that he did it because it brought him genuine joy. She thanked him sincerely. The treat was on the table, a cheesecake. Laurier stared at it, wide-eyed, and asked if people really made desserts out of cheese. Cheese-based sweets were essentially unheard of in this world, so her confusion was completely understandable. He told her to try it. Sasha thanked him again for the treat. Laurier's first bite produced an expression of complete wonder. She said it was incredible. Sasha agreed. Simply delicious. Karis was glad. Honestly, it had come out well. He remembered the real thing from his past life. So he knew he still had room to improve, but the smiles on their faces told him everything he needed to know. It was a success. Then he remembered the letter. He told Laurier that an invitation to a tea party from Princess Serena had arrived in her name. Laurier sat up in surprise. Sasha was surprised too. They'd only just met the girl today. She said she hadn't expected a friendship to form quite that quickly. Karis told Laurier clearly, if she didn't want to go, he wouldn't push her. He asked what she thought. Laurier considered it for a moment, then straightened up, and said she wanted to go. She genuinely wanted to spend more time with the princess. Karis picked up his cup of tea and said he was glad for her. He told her that since she was going, she should make sure to have a good time. The girl laughed, and then her expression shifted into something a little shy. She looked at her father and asked permission to bring his sweets for Princess Serena. Karis said he didn't mind at all and asked, genuinely curious, where that idea had come from. Laurier said with a smile that his desserts tasted like happiness, and she wanted as many people as possible to get to try them. Karis privately declared this child to be a genuine angel. He told her that since she was taking them to the palace, he'd make sure to prepare something truly special. He just asked her not to force the princess to eat if she wasn't interested. Laurier told her dad everything would be fine, his sweets were the absolute best. They hugged. Sasha chimed in to agree that the desserts were magnificent and that Princess Serena would certainly be won over. Karis smiled at all of this and thought about the one wrinkle in the plan. Homemade sweets for the royal family. He was going to have to genuinely outdo himself so his daughter wouldn't end up embarrassed. And this Princess Serena, there was something curious about her that Karis couldn't quite place. He just hoped she meant his daughter no harm. Laurier arrived at the royal palace for her tea with Princess Serena, her father walking her in and seeing her off at the door. She thanked him sincerely and joyfully for coming with her, and Karis, clearly worried, asked one last time if she was really sure she'd be fine on her own in there. Laurier told him the palace was full of maids, there'd be plenty of other children around, and she had her father's sweets in hand. So yes, she was sure. He was moved. He ruffled her hair, smiled, and said in that case they'd leave together when she was done. The girl was delighted. He wished her a wonderful time at the princess's tea party. She held the wrapped cheesecake carefully in both hands, absolutely beaming. A maid took her away, and Laurier waved back at her father one last time, wishing him a good day at work. Karis waved back and stood there watching her go. It was impossible to put into words, but children seem to grow not by days but by hours, and it was absolutely true. Just a short time ago, Laurier could barely manage to hold a smile that wasn't forced. The fact that she was now smiling so freely and warmly that made him genuinely happy, but she was growing up, which also meant she was gradually becoming more her own person, and that made him feel something complicated he hadn't expected. This was probably just how all parents felt when the world started becoming more interesting to their children than their father's hand. His fatherly heart, he already knew, would absolutely not survive the day she got married. At her wedding, he was going to be completely useless, weeping the whole way through. He was still standing in the middle of the royal courtyard, face visibly distressed when the people around him started noticing. Maids and other guests approached in concern, asking Duke Fo if he was feeling all right if he was in pain. He shook himself out of it and reminded himself he had business to take care of. After a while, that business was finished. He looked thoroughly exhausted, but had wrapped everything up faster than expected, and he still couldn't understand why aristocrats required so much bureaucratic red tape. With time to spare, his mind drifted immediately back to Laurier, still at the tea party. Probably. He decided to take a walk through the garden while he waited. The royal garden was exactly what you'd expect, immaculate, serene, clearly maintained with obsessive care. Very quiet. The kind of place Karis found genuinely peaceful. He was just beginning to enjoy the silence when he heard noise coming from somewhere in the hedges. Muffled voices, followed by the sight of a pair of small legs sticking out of the shrubbery. He went to investigate. Inside the bushes was a little boy roughly Laurier's age, maybe slightly older. No commoner would have any business being in the royal garden, which meant the child was almost certainly from a noble family. Karis thought briefly about the aristocratic principle of not inserting yourself into other people's problems. Then he looked at this kid and immediately set that aside. Children didn't get that rule applied to them. The boy was sitting on the grass with his face buried against his knees and his eyes shut, clearly miserable. Karis told him gently not to sit on the ground like that. He'd get his clothes dirty. The boy looked up at him with big, sad eyes. Something in Karis's head went off. He felt like he'd seen this child somewhere before, but before he could place it, the boy quietly said it didn't matter. Karis's expression shifted. The boy put his head back down on his knees and continued in a low, bleak voice. No one needed him anyway. His father had plenty to be proud of even without him. Karis sat down on the ground next to him and asked, wasn't he the one and only in the world to his father? The boy lifted his head and asked what he meant. Karis replied that children were a genuine treasure to their parents, and no matter how many a person had, every single one was infinitely precious. The boy's face crumpled. He said that no matter how hard he tried, everything fell apart. People told him he was good for nothing, that he couldn't measure up to his older brother. Karis felt for him. He told him gently he didn't have to be a copy of his older brother. The boy looked up sharply surprised and asked what he thought. Karis told him he wasn't his brother. Of course he couldn't do everything exactly the way his brother did. That was perfectly natural. He was himself, and he just needed to find something that only he could do, his own talent. The boy repeated those words slowly. Karis said only this boy would be able to figure out what that was for himself. He still had all the time in the world to learn, to grow, to find his own path. The boy's lips trembled but pulled slightly upward, and through wet eyes he asked Karis if he really thought he could do it. Karis patted his head and said he was absolutely certain. He told the boy what a wonderful thing it was to have such an outstanding older brother to look up to, and that he was sure this boy would reach heights just as great in his own way. The child stood up carefully from the grass, gathered himself, and said he would try. He thanked Karis sincerely, and Karis wished him luck. He got up and turned to leave, but the boy called after him and asked if he could know his name. Karis, a little caught off guard, introduced himself warmly. The boy's eyes went wide. Meanwhile, Karis's thoughts had already circled back to one thing. Where was his daughter right now? At that exact moment, a small group of 5 girls was standing in a nearby stretch of the garden, and among them were Laurier and Serena, chatting and laughing without a care in the world. Almost the moment Laurier spotted her father, she turned and came running. They hugged warmly. He asked if the tea party was already over. She said yes and asked if he was free now. He'd gotten everything done ahead of schedule, but he said all that could wait, because what he actually wanted to know was, had she had a good time? She lit up and told him it had been very, very fun. Yes, then Princess Serena approached. She greeted Duke Fo graciously, and he thanked her for inviting his daughter. Serena said she was the one who should be thanking him. She and Laurier had had a genuinely wonderful time together. Karis was quietly impressed by how Serena carried herself. For an 8-year-old, she was almost disconcertingly composed, and for some reason he found it difficult to communicate with her in the usual way. He replied he was glad to hear it. Serena then said that Duke Fo's sweets had been absolutely spectacular, and asked with complete poise whether he had truly made them himself. He said he had. She asked if, should it not be too much trouble, he would make them for her again sometime. He smiled and said anytime she wished. Serena replied that in that case she would be paying a visit to his estate the following week. She would very much like another taste. That moment, when simple politeness unexpectedly becomes an actual confirmed visit, was a little something Karis hadn't entirely planned for. He told the princess they'd be eagerly waiting for her. Serena turned back to Laurier to say she'd see her next week. Laurier thanked the princess for the wonderful day. But just before she left, Serena turned back to Karis and asked if she could whisper something in his ear. He agreed, a little puzzled. She moved close to him and said quietly directly that he was a time traveler who had retained memories of his past life. Then she ran off, waving cheerfully. Karis froze. The words didn't register immediately. Then they did, and then the implications of what had just happened started to settle. He began to suspect, with growing alarm, that the princess had figured him out. Laurier tugged on his sleeve and asked if he was all right. He told her he was fine, not wanting her to worry. But he couldn't get Serena's words out of his head. He asked Laurier what they talked about at the tea party. She said Serena had asked how things were at home, whether she got along with her mother, and about sweets. Karis chewed on that. Nothing there felt threatening to Laurier specifically. And based on everything he'd observed, Serena didn't seem to mean his daughter any harm. That reassured him somewhat. He wasn't going to sound the alarm just yet. He told Laurier he'd work on something extra special for their guest next week. The girl was thrilled. When they got home, Sasha was waiting for them, and her reaction to the news about Serena's visit was, well, shocked would be putting it lightly. Karis said it seemed Laurier and the princess had become friends surprisingly quickly. Sasha looked genuinely horrified and covered her mouth with her hand. Karis was delighted by this and said it seemed their daughter was growing up to be quite a sociable girl. He laughed. He thought Laurier was every bit as warm and kind as her mother, so of course people were drawn to her. His wife replied that her own heart was nowhere near as pure as their daughter's, and blushed. Karis immediately took her hand, looked her in the eye, and told her she had the kindest heart of anyone he knew. Sasha looked down sadly and said he was wrong. She said she'd spent years thinking only of herself, desperate for attention, and in chasing that she'd completely lost sight of Laurier. Laurier, despite all of it, had found the strength to forgive her. That's why Sasha believed Laurier had the purest heart in the world. Karis pulled his wife close. He told her he was partly responsible too. In fact, he was the most responsible of all, for shutting them both out from the beginning. He swore to give them twice as much love from here on and to always be beside her. He told Sasha he loved her more than anything, and she told him that she had always loved him with her whole heart, and she was glad they had met. I'll admit, I had a small oh come on moment when Princess Serena showed up and turned out to also have past life memories. At first, it felt like a convenient plot device to introduce someone who could just explain the game to Karis and acknowledge what he's doing, but the more I sat with it, the more I think it actually works. Because Serena doesn't become an ally who makes everything easy, she's immediately a wild card. You don't fully trust her. Karis doesn't fully trust her, and the way she whispers his secret at him and runs away is genuinely unsettling in a fun way. She's not here to help him. She's here out of curiosity. That's a more interesting dynamic than a supportive ally, and I think it could go somewhere unexpected. The following week arrived and Princess Serena came to the Faux estate as promised. They met in Karis's study. He welcomed her and said he was glad to have her. Serena, completely at ease, remarked that it was a truly lovely study. Karis replied that as far as he was aware, she was supposed to be having tea with Laurier right now, and asked what had brought her here. The girl asked if he didn't find it rather rude to greet a lady with that kind of question. He didn't take the bait. He replied that if she were a proper lady, she wouldn't have walked into a stranger's private study without permission. He stood up from his desk and added that, with all respect to her title, these walls contain the confidential affairs of the ducal house. He asked her politely but firmly to refrain from doing this again in the future. Serena huffed a little, but didn't push it. She said it was a trivial matter and asked directly. He tensed. She asked Duke Faux plainly, did he truly remember a past life in another world? His expression went blank. He worked through the angles quickly. Lying probably wasn't going to work. Her face told him she'd already decided on the answer. He asked her directly. Since she was asking, did that mean she had no doubts? Serena sat herself down on the sofa in his office and replied with composure. First, something strange had clearly happened to Karis. He'd had some kind of fall and hit his head. And after that, his relationship with his family had been transformed overnight. Honestly, anyone paying attention would find that suspicious. Karis thought, that's a logical read. But he also knew that if he went on the defensive, she'd keep dictating terms. So instead, he turned it back on her and asked whether she herself seemed to have some knowledge from a past life. Serena laughed and said she absolutely adored men who caught on quickly, and that if he didn't already have a wife, she'd have proposed to him on the spot. He laughed at that. She said yes, it was a joke, and she was glad he'd finally relaxed. He scratched the back of his head and admitted he'd panicked for nothing. He said there was no hiding anything from Princess Serena, but he wanted her to know one thing, whether joking or serious. Sasha would always be his one and only wife. He put his hand over his heart. He meant every word. Serena looked at him for a moment and laughed quietly. The rumors about Mr. Foe being completely devoted to his wife were apparently very accurate. He said simply he couldn't see anyone else beside him but Sasha. He asked anxiously what came next. After all, she hadn't come here just to confirm he was from another world. The princess confirmed he was right. The case of a villain's father who retained memories of a past life was so unprecedented that she simply could not resist seeing it for herself. Karis noted with a cold internal chill that she had just referred to him as the villain's father, which also meant she knew the game. She remembered the plot. She asked, with the manner of someone already sure of the answer, whether he was familiar with Pure Love Princess, your super flirty romance. He said yes. She said she hadn't imagined men played games like that and jokingly suggested maybe he'd been a woman in his past life. He said he was afraid he'd have to disappoint her. She said she'd draw her own conclusions. He asked her seriously to please not do that either. She set the jokes aside and told him plainly that everything was now clear to her. If Karis knew the plot of the game, then the changes in Laurier's character made complete sense. In the original story, Laurier had been an insufferably proud girl from a very young age, which is exactly why, when they'd met at the tea party, her genuine childlike warmth had so struck Serena. It clearly wasn't what she'd been expecting. Karis thought about it and concluded, if Laurier had kept suffering under that etiquette tutor, growing up in a household where her parents were barely functioning as a couple, she almost certainly would have become that villain. Arrogance, after all, is just vulnerability with armor on. It's what people build when they have no other way to protect themselves. And if he'd arrived in this body even a moment later, he might not have been in time. His heart bled for the version of Laurier who hadn't had that chance, but as Laurier, the one actually growing up under his roof, was becoming a genuine little angel, he was doing things right. Then Serena mentioned, as if passing, that the sweets at the tea party had been completely out of step with anything you'd normally find in this world. She asked Laurier about them, and Laurier had proudly announced her father had made them, and had also told everyone at the table that her father had changed completely, and was simply wonderful now. Karis was touched, genuinely. Then he immediately reminded himself this was not the time to go soft. In a more measured tone he asked Serena if she was finished with her inspection. She said yes, in her view. They actually had far more in common to discuss than she'd anticipated, and she was glad she'd come in person. Now she wanted to move on to the second matter. He braced himself. She told him she had come to thank him. He had absolutely no idea what for. She was surprised he hadn't figured it out. He scratched the back of his head and said whether he'd guessed or not, he genuinely didn't know what she was talking about. She said it was about her younger brother. He still wasn't following. She explained, the boy in the garden. The fair-haired boy sitting in the bushes last week, that was her younger brother. The second prince. His name was Seru, and he was one of the main love interests in the Otome game. The character in whose route Laurier Foe plays the villain. Karis shot to his feet. He asked her to say that again. She repeated it calmly. The boy he'd sat with by the flower beds, the boy he'd told to find his own path, was the game's main character. The Prince Karis couldn't process it. How was he supposed to have known? In every illustration he'd ever seen, Seru was an adult. Serena told him what had happened next. Seru had come to his sister shortly after and asked if she knew a man named Karis. He said he very much wanted to thank him. Serena said it had moved her. She'd assumed at first that Karis had shown the boy kindness knowing exactly who he was, but as it turned out, he'd done it simply because it was the right thing to do. Karis told her honestly he hadn't recognized the prince at all. He'd assumed the boy was some noble's child wandering the grounds. He said he still didn't quite understand what there was to be thanked for. They'd only exchanged a few words. He didn't feel like he'd done anything remarkable. Serena smiled and said her brother had told her. Thanks to what Karis had said, he'd finally been able to find something that was uniquely his, because ever since childhood, Seru had been measured against his brilliant older brother, the first prince. Karis's words had been a genuine lifeline to him. She asked, surely he hadn't truly comforted the boy entirely by accident. Karis laughed. It was the most ordinary thing any adult would say to a confused child. Seru's title and the expectations around him had been weighing too heavily. That was all, he told Serena. There was nothing to thank him for. Guiding a lost young person back onto the right path was the basic duty of any adult. Looking after children was their direct responsibility. Serena looked at him for a moment and said she was starting to like him more and more, then started up the jokes again about divorce and marriage. He made clear, once again, that this was completely off the table, even in jest. She said it was a pity, but didn't argue. He noted privately that based on the way she spoke, Serena had probably been significantly older in her past life. Trying to guess a lady's age, however, was the height of bad manners, so he left it there. After a brief pause, Serena told him she'd already conducted her business, he'd better get back to Laurier. She understood that making his daughter wait was probably pure torture for him. He said she'd hit it exactly right. She said they still had things to discuss, but asked one final question before he left. He told her to go ahead. She looked at him with a serious expression and asked, knowing the game's plot, knowing the role Laurier was destined to play, would he still protect her? Karis smiled. He told her he'd been wondering what she'd ask him this time. Then he asked a question back. Was there a father anywhere in the world who didn't want his daughter to be happy? She replied that anything was possible. Of course, circumstances and surroundings could change a person beyond recognition, but Karis said his answer wasn't going to change. As a father, he would never wish for his daughter's ruin. He would do everything in his power to protect her. He wanted Laurier to marry the man she loved, and one day say with a smile that she was truly happy. He was simply not going to allow his daughter to become a villain. Serena laughed and said she understood that she'd upset him. As she said goodbye, she told him she'd look forward to their next conversation. He said the feeling was mutual and asked her to continue being a good friend to Laurier. She said she would. She was nearly out the door when she turned back and made one more request. Could he prepare sweets for her family next time? He said he didn't mind, but pointed out, since she remembered her past life, that she could at least try to learn a little cooking herself. Serena dropped her head sadly and said cooking was unfortunately not her thing at all. He didn't press for details, he just said he understood. She brightened and said that on the other hand her cheat knowledge from her past life came in very handy for sewing and needlework. And then an idea came to her. She proposed a deal. She would make outfits for his wife and daughter. He would supply the desserts. He was genuinely delighted and agreed immediately, though he warned her not to expect culinary masterpieces given how limited the local ingredients were. She said the level from the previous tea party would be more than sufficient. She announced they had a deal, flashed him a radiant smile, waved goodbye at the door, and was gone. Kariz waved back and stood there for a moment. The deal was a little strange, he had to admit, but if she truly had golden hands with a needle, the quality would take care of itself. And if the payment for beautiful dresses for his girls was simply his sweets, that was a remarkably favorable arrangement. He couldn't say Serena had stopped raising questions for him entirely, but she no longer felt like a threat to his family, and that was enough for now. Having someone who knew this game's plot in his corner, even someone as unpredictable as her, could be a significant advantage. He just sincerely hoped their paths would cross as infrequently as possible, managing the affairs of his lands, sorting through the mountain of paperwork that came with running a duchy. This, Karis reflected, was aristocracy in its truest form. The House of Fo had originally been administrators. At one point in history, they had even held the position of royal chancellor. On the other side of the equation were the military noble families, the backbone of the kingdom's armed forces, whose members often held the post of knight commander. Each side served in its distinct role. Administrative and military aristocrats moving in separate lanes, which is what made the following fact so absurd to Karis. Why on earth would a descendant of a pure administrator family? Why would the former Karis be so blindingly skilled with a sword? Because it turned out he was, at some point before taking over the ducal house, the original Karis had served in the country's order of knights. The full story was a long one he'd save for another time, but his reputation there had earned him a nickname, the Sword Demon. His abilities had been so far beyond average that he'd drawn serious attention from veterans within the order. Karis stood there training now, striking hundreds of blows without stopping, and noticed he'd barely expended the energy he'd expected to. He looked genuinely uneasy about it. The man he used to be in Japan had only ever seen swords in pictures. He'd had every reason to expect to be terrible at this. But muscle memory didn't care about his Japanese past. His body moved on instinct, like it had been doing this its entire life. This was the power of what the knights had called the Sword Demon. Several years had passed since he'd left the order, and he was probably running at less than half his former peak. And still it was extraordinary. Standing there catching his breath, Karis let himself feel a moment of sheer bewilderment at the hand he'd been dealt. A handsome man in his prime, exceptional talent, high status, a beautiful wife, a charming daughter. He wanted to just shout it at the sky. He knew, of course, that what looks like happiness from the outside isn't always happiness from the inside. But still, just then cheerful voices called out to him. Sasha and Laurier were coming down the path. He called back to them. They said C had told them he was out here. They'd been watching him practice. Little Laurier tugged insistently at her father's shirt and announced with her eyes squeezed shut that her father was incredibly cool. He thanked her and immediately turned to Sasha to ask if she'd enjoyed the display. She tucked her arms in front of her, flushing, and said her husband had been magnificent. He felt very pleased. He told them he'd love to hug them both right now, but he was sweaty from training, so maybe a little later. Laurier's face immediately crumpled. She got anxious and thought he meant he wouldn't hug her at all. He clarified not that he didn't want to, more that she probably wouldn't enjoy being hugged by someone soaked in sweat. She shot back that it absolutely didn't matter, and looked like she'd already convinced herself the worst was true. He looked at this little girl and thought obviously he was going to hug her, so he picked her up and pulled her close, and she laughed with complete happiness. Then Sasha gently tugged at his arm. He and Laurier both looked at her in surprise. Sasha stared down at the ground, cheeks pink, and very quietly said she wouldn't mind a hug either. He He wrapped an arm around her too without hesitating. All three of them stayed like that, the three of them together. Laurier told her father he was very strong. He was flattered. He looked at the two of them, one in each arm, and thought that in each hand he was holding a beautiful flower. Okay, here's the thing about this chapter. I actually think the sword demon reveal is one of the more interesting decisions the manga has made so far. It would have been very easy to leave Karis as just a smart, thoughtful dad working things out politically. But giving him this obscured past, this identity he sort of inherited without fully knowing it, and then watching him practice and realizing he's genuinely astonishing at something he didn't earn in this lifetime, adds this strange layer to him. He's inhabiting someone else's excellence. He didn't build this reputation. And I think there's something quietly compelling about a man who is given all of this and chooses to spend it on tea parties and cookie recipes and hugging his daughter. He could be the sword demon. He's choosing to be the dad. Morning came and Karis was sitting in the mansion visibly not enjoying himself. Yesterday had been a good day. Today reality had hit him in the face with a stack of paperwork. He couldn't understand why aristocrats always had this much work, and he wasn't being lazy about it. The duchy's estates were enormous, problems poured in from every direction, and keeping all of it under control fell on him. Honestly, if he had his way, he'd spend every free hour with Sasha and Laurier. But some matters simply required him to be physically present. Today was one of those days. Several things at the royal castle demanded his personal attendance. Leaving his girls alone at home sat uncomfortably with him even now, though at least the estate was staffed by the best people he'd been able to find, personally selected. No one was getting anywhere near the faux residence uninvited. Back when he hadn't cared about his family, he'd hired without much thought. The result had been a household full of slackers and genuinely shady characters, guards with questionable backgrounds, tutors with violent tempers, maids who avoided their duties. He'd swept every single one of them out and started fresh. He still felt uneasy leaving, though, which meant the faster he got through his business, the better. At the palace, he ran into Viscount Gris, a man who lit up at the sight of him and said with a laugh it was quite something to see Duke Fo himself here. It had been a long time. Karis thought through what he knew. Viscount Gris, commander of the Order of Knights, responsible for the kingdom's security, a sword genius who had risen to that position not through title, but through sheer skill, earning the recognition of the Order's veterans despite coming from a Viscount family rather than a ducal one. A remarkable person in response to the man's joke about him joining the Order. Karis smiled and said that was unfortunately out of the question. He wouldn't be going back. He'd served his time and his duty now was to serve as a duke. Gris looked a little genuinely disappointed. He told Karis the stories of his old exploits were legendary, and that if he ever changed his mind, a high-ranking position and excellent terms were waiting for him, guaranteed. They shook hands. Karis said he was flattered, but those kinds of demands weren't suited to his aging body anymore, and he'd long since stepped back from military affairs. He thought it would only create headaches for the whole order if someone like him came back into active duty. Gris disagreed strongly, and said the current generation of knights would find it inspiring, and his old comrades would be overjoyed. Karis scratched the back of his head and said the man was overestimating him. He replied honestly he was grateful for the high regard, but he wanted to spend more time with his family now, his wife and daughter, so he had to decline. Gris looked stunned. Then he admitted he'd heard the rumors, that Duke Fo had recently repaired his relationship with his family, that he seemed like a completely different person, that he'd come to genuinely love them. Karis fell quiet for a moment. Had the old Karis really neglected his family so thoroughly that the gossip had reached other noble houses? He laughed to cover how taken aback he was. Then something shifted behind the Viscount. Karis noticed motion and looked past him. A small boy was hovering there, clearly trying not to be seen. Karis asked carefully who was hiding back there. Gris turned around and apologized. It was his son, Revan Gris. He told the boy to step forward and greet the Duke. Revan clasped his hands and fidgeted with his collar, and then introduced himself so softly you could barely hear it, eyes down. Gris immediately got sharp with him, saying he'd told him many times you greet someone loudly and clearly. Revan started to say something. Gris cut him off. He said there was no room for buts. Revan was the heir of the Viscount Gris household, and the future knight who would protect this country needed more confidence than that. Karis watched this exchange. He recognized something in it immediately. A father with Spartan instincts, and a son who'd been beaten down so thoroughly by the comparison that he'd stopped trusting himself. Another family's business. He knew he probably shouldn't meddle. But this boy Revan reminded him so painfully of Laurier not long ago. He spoke up, apologizing to Gris first. He told him gently, "Don't intimidate the boy like that." Gris didn't follow at first, then pushed back. His son was growing up weak-willed, and the heir to the Gris household needed to be made of stronger stuff. Karis understood where that was coming from. He understood Gris was doing this out of love for his son, but he said plainly, Revan was not his father. He was his own person. He told Gris, just talk to your son more. That's it. Revan stood to the side, shrinking into himself. Then Karis crouched toward Revan and introduced himself. The boy replied softly. Karis patted him on the head, which startled him. He told Revan it was completely normal to be shy around strangers, and his outstanding father was right there beside him, so he could stand a little taller. Revan said quietly that it was true, but he didn't have anywhere near his father's talent with a sword, and clenched his hands. Karis said that at his age it was far too early to talk about talent. He told him if he didn't have it yet, he could develop it. Revan looked surprised. Karis asked if he loved his father. The boy said yes. Karis continued, so he admired him. Revan said yes, he wanted to be just like him someday, an outstanding knight. Karis said in that case he needed to find his own path toward that and work to become a knight who surpassed his father. Revan said he didn't know what his own path meant. Karis said that was something only he'd be able to see as he grew and gained experience. But whatever path it turned out to be, if he truly wanted to get closer to the father he admired, he had to give it everything, and his father was strict with him because his expectations were high. Revan absorbed that. Karis told him not to take it as a burden, just remember that his father loved him and wanted only the best for him. Revan looked up and said quietly, but with something more solid in it this time, that he would try. He was a little scared right now, but he would find his path. Karis stood up and told the boy that was wonderful. He wished him luck. He apologized again to Grease for inserting himself, then told him sincerely, behind all of Revan's shyness was a truly strong spirit. He asked him to believe that his son would become a far more exceptional knight than he could currently imagine. Grease admitted he was genuinely taken aback. He hadn't expected words like that about his own son. He looked at Revan and ruffled his hair and looked at him with something warm in his eyes. Revan looked like he didn't know what to do with that, just as Karis said his goodbyes and turned to leave. Revan stopped him. Karis turned around. The boy stood up straight and told Duke Fo that he would become just as outstanding a knight as his dad. Karis said he'd look forward to it and smiled. He thought about it as he walked away. This happened in family after family, fathers and children who barely talked, each one carrying so much more than the other knew. Children's minds held things that surpassed every parental assumption. Parents were supposed to know their children better than anyone, and yet so often they were the last to see what mattered most. Karis knew that. He understood it. He wasn't going to be one of those fathers who let it happen. He needed to get through his remaining work as fast as possible and get home to Sasha and Laurier. Every time this story puts Karis in front of a struggling kid, I find myself more charmed by how he handles it, and also mildly frustrated because the advice he gives is so simple. Don't compare yourself to your brother. Find your own path. Talk to your son. None of this is revolutionary wisdom, but somehow the people in this world just aren't doing it, and I think that's the point. The story isn't arguing that Karis is uniquely perceptive. It's arguing that basic warmth and basic presence are actually the rarest things in this aristocratic world, which makes his very ordinary kindness feel genuinely extraordinary by contrast. Smart choice by the mangaka. Only a week left before the big day, and Karis had thought everything through down to the last detail. He was overcome with emotion in the kitchen, and C came running at the sound of it. He asked anxiously if everything was all right. Garlic, already in the kitchen, laughed at the master's behavior. C begged him not to shout like that in there. Karis apologized and explained he couldn't contain himself. C admitted he'd been surprised when Mr. Karis decided to throw a birthday celebration for the young lady at all. Karis replied that not acknowledging his own daughter's birthday before had been unacceptable, and that celebrating your child's birthday was the most natural thing in the world. He wanted it to be a surprise. C said he understood, but asked him not to overwork himself, then excused himself back to his duties. Karis thanked him and then announced a little too loudly that he was getting to work. Garlic reminded him no shouting. He apologized. Garlic asked if Mr. Karis was really sure he wanted to handle the cake himself. Karis said absolutely on a day like this. He had to try his hardest for Laurier. He had every confidence in Garlic's dishes and said as much. Garlic promised to prepare everything from the new recipes Karis had given him. Those were dishes from his Japanese memories, things children loved adapted with local ingredients. A real test of Garlic's skills, and Karis was genuinely curious what he'd produce. For himself, he was taking on the most important piece, the cake. He'd been baking often enough lately that he developed a feel for it. Laurier had a sweet tooth, so he wanted something extra sweet for her, but then he remembered that Sasha didn't love things that were overly sugary. He thought about it. Obviously, Laurier was the guest of honor. It made more sense to bake to her taste. But he wanted Sasha to enjoy it too. He also remembered that Sasha had recently been feeling unwell and had mentioned she was craving something tart and refreshing. At the time he'd fussed over her and warned her to tell him if she got worse. She'd said she was fine. But now he had an idea. He'd bake a lemon cake for Sasha and a rich sweet one for Laurier. He immediately started on a test batch. A little while later, spreading frosting over the lemon cake, he was pleased. This was his first time making one and he was nervous, but it had turned out quite well. The one for Laurier was another story. It looked beautiful on the outside but didn't taste nearly as sweet as he'd imagined. Something wasn't right. Then one of the maids came rushing into the kitchen, calling out to Mr. Karras with visible alarm. It was Sasha's personal maid. She said, "Mrs. Sasha had lost consciousness, that she'd first complained of nausea and then collapsed. Karras left the kitchen immediately. He ran to his wife's room, heart pounding, blaming himself for not insisting on a thorough examination when she'd first felt ill. He prayed she was going to be all right. When he got there, the doctor was sitting beside Sasha's bed. The man looked up with a smile. He had good news. Sasha was pregnant. She sat on the bed, smiling softly, and Karras went completely still. His wife explained that her recent discomfort had apparently all been caused by this, and apologized for making him worry. He crossed the room and hugged her without a word. He thanked God. Once the doctor had gone and they were alone, he took both her hands and told her this was a true blessing, and that he was so relieved she was all right. She tried to get out of bed. He told her with some urgency that she absolutely could not be getting up and needed to rest. She looked like she wanted to argue. She couldn't quite manage it against his expression, and lay back down. He stroked her hair and thanked her for carrying a new member of their family. Sasha blushed and said that with how passionately he'd loved her lately, it wasn't very surprising it had come to this. He smiled and said it was entirely because she was so charming. She told him to stop bringing that up. She said his parents were going to be absolutely thrilled to hear about a second child. Karras thought about what that would actually look like. His parents' shock was going to be considerable, given that the original Karras had been spectacularly avoidant of anything resembling a normal marriage. After the wedding, the only reason Laurier existed at all was because his parents had pressured him as the eldest heir. The distance between him and Sasha had been total, and now out of nowhere a second child. He'd have to be a prophet to predict his parents' faces. He told Sasha that whatever the case, this was their precious child, and this new life would only draw them closer together. She asked what he meant by that. He said this new life was the fruit of their love. She got flustered and asked if there was a better way to put it. He said no, that was exactly what it was, and leaned close to her ear to suggest maybe some more specific wording. She cried out in embarrassment, and he laughed. A few days later, Laurier's birthday. Karras had been emotional since morning, and both C and Garlic were dealing with the fallout. C asked him to please not shout in the kitchen. He was sorry, he was just very happy. Once things were calmer, he went and waited outside the room where his daughter was finishing her last lesson of the day. The young, polite teacher wrapped up the session and told Laurier they were done. Laurier thanked her with real warmth. Karras came in, and she looked up in surprise. He leaned toward her and asked if her lessons were all finished today. She said yes and asked about his work. He said he had something important he'd wanted to discuss with her. So he'd finished early. Laurier was surprised. He led her to a large ornate closed door and told her this was where they were going. He asked her to open it herself. She opened the door inside, garlands hanging from the ceiling, flowers and bright ribbons covering the walls. Laurier spun around to her father, eyes wide, and asked what this was. It was so beautiful. He ruffled her hair and explained they'd decorated the room for her birthday. He mentioned that her mother had wanted to be here too, but she wasn't feeling well right now, so he hoped Laurier would go visit her a little later. Laurier looked up at him and asked with genuine puzzlement what a birthday was. Karras looked at her face and felt something heavy and quiet settle in his chest. She'd never had one before. Of course she didn't know. He explained a birthday was a day to express gratitude, to thank Laurier for coming into the world. It was the day she was born, which is why they were celebrating it. Laurier listened with her eyes getting larger and larger. She asked, uncertain and soft, if that meant he and her mother were happy she'd been born to them. Karras said of course they were. He and Sasha were infinitely glad Laurier had become their daughter. He stood up, took her by the hand, and led her into the room. Standing inside were two young women in beautiful festive dresses. Their names were Mia and Rear, maids in the faux household. Laurier was pleasantly surprised to see them. Karras explained, starting next year, they'd invite her friends and throw proper parties. But for this first one, they'd kept it small, just the people who truly cared about her. Laurier noticed the dresses immediately. Normally, Mia and Rear wore their white maid uniforms. He explained they weren't on duty right now. They were guests invited here to celebrate. She was astonished that they would sit and eat with her. Carrie said yes, they would. The two maids leaned in and offered Laurier their heartfelt congratulations and told her she'd grown so beautifully. Laurier was genuinely delighted and thanked them. Looking at this small gathering, Karras felt settled in his decision. A grand celebration for the very first time would have come with a sea of complications, and he was afraid it would have stopped Laurier from actually enjoying herself. Garlic came out carrying a huge tray of beautiful food and set it down. Karras invited the birthday girl to eat before it got cold. Laurier picked up a fork and tasted, and her whole face shifted into pure joy. She turned to her father and told him it was simply incredible and immediately held up a fork to let him try. Rear quietly tried to correct the young lady's manners. Karras stopped her and said everything was fine. Then he turned to the room and said, Was there a father alive who could say no when his beloved daughter was offering to feed him? He'd gladly try it. Laurier fed him and asked if it was delicious. He told her it absolutely was. He said eating together made everything taste better. She said she really, really loved eating with her father. He noticed again just how pure this child was. Then Laurier went quiet and got a little sad. She said that if her mother were here, it would be even better. He told her she was right, and that when Mom woke up, all three of them would eat the cake together. Laurier's eyes went wide. There was a cake. Her father had made it himself with all his love. He told her he'd worked very hard on it, for her and for Mom. He asked her to look forward to it. Another angel moment from Laurier, he was certain of it. He was struck again by how happy he was that she was expressing her feelings so freely now. Though he acknowledged privately that when she hit adolescence, that same openness might sometimes be aimed at him, telling him she hated him on a bad day. His fatherly heart was already aching preemptively. Laurier noticed his expression cloud over and tugged at his sleeve, asking if his stomach hurt. He snapped out of it and said no, nothing terrible had happened, he was fine. He reminded himself, worrying about adolescence when she was still 4 was perhaps getting ahead of things. He still had so much to learn. He took her hand at the table and told her, no matter what happened, he would always be her father. She could be herself, do whatever she wanted, and no matter what came, he would always be on her side. She and Sasha were his most precious people in the world. Laurier looked at him with the honest confusion of someone too young to fully absorb that. Then she immediately brightened and laughed at him. He smiled back. He didn't think she'd fully understood what he meant, but that was all right. He still had a lot to learn as a father. For now, he was going to do everything in his power and watch her grow with love. He just had to make sure he didn't turn into the kind of father who followed his daughter to every event and hovered over her whole life. He cheerfully encouraged her to eat more and fed her. The girl was happy. Later, they went to Sasha's room. Karis knocked gently. She let them in. He asked how she was feeling. She was sitting up in bed and said much better than that morning. Laurier rushed to her and asked if she was really feeling better. Sasha hugged her and apologized for missing the party. She said she had really wanted to celebrate with them. Laurier took her mother's hands and told her the most important thing was for her to be healthy. Please rest and get well. Sasha thanked her with tears in her voice. Karis watched them and thought that there was no better word for this scene than lovely. This was what paradise looked like. Goddesses and little angels. He cleared his throat and asked Sasha if she had any appetite. She thought about it and said she could eat something light and refreshing, just a little. He lit up and said that today's treat was made exactly for her. She looked at him in surprise. A broad smile broke across Laurier's face. He brought in the tray and presented his work. For Sasha, a cake with a careful balance of lemon tartness and sweetness. For Laurier, a rich strawberry shortcake. Sasha asked if the celebration wasn't already over. What was all this? He told her yes, the 4 of them had already had dinner together with Mia and Rear, but today was too important a day to end without all 3 of them sitting together as a family. He'd saved the main cake specifically for that. Sasha said softly that he'd gone to so much trouble for her sake. He told her Laurier had said herself how much she wanted to share this with her mother. Laurier confirmed it loudly. Sasha held her daughter and thanked them both for everything. Karis set up the table and asked them to wait a moment. He cut each cake into slices, arranged them on plates, handed out forks, and did everything with neat precision. Sasha said it all looked absolutely gorgeous. He agreed. Then he picked up a fork, turned to Sasha, and asked her to open her mouth. She turned very red and refused. He didn't give up. Laurier joined in from her side. Sasha finally, unable to hold out, opened her mouth. He put the cake in, and she said genuinely that it was insanely delicious. Laurier pointed at herself immediately. He turned to her, picked up a fork, and asked her to open up. She opened her mouth like a little bird. He fed her. Sasha laughed watching this. Laurier declared it really, really good. Then Laurier pointed at her mother and announced she'd already finished her cake, but Mom hadn't. Sasha looked shy again. Karis asked her to open her mouth one more time. She protested that she could eat on her own. Laurier and Karis would not be moved. She opened her mouth. After all 3 of them had eaten, the ladies thanked him. Karis slipped out of the room and came back with a large box tied in a festive ribbon. He set it before Laurier. Her birthday gift? She asked what it was. He told her to open it. She untied the ribbon. Inside was a large, fluffy stuffed animal shaped like a little sheep. Laurier immediately declared it the most adorable thing she'd ever seen and asked if her father had really made it himself. Yes, he'd had someone teach him how to sew and had made it especially for today. Her mouth fell completely open. Sasha looked equally stunned. He confirmed. Today was her birthday, and he wanted to give her something to remember it by. So he'd sewn this. Laurier hugged the toy to her chest and told him she would treasure it forever and ever. He told her he was very glad she liked it. He was honestly nervous. It was his first time sewing anything. But seeing her face was all the relief he needed. She showed it to her mother right away. Sasha said she was so happy for her, and that the gift was beautiful. Karis was certain the effort had been worth every moment. Then Sasha went quiet, and a little sad. He noticed and asked what was wrong. She said she'd been thinking she should have made Laurier a gift herself, something with her own hands. He took her hands gently and told her not to worry, next year they would prepare something together. She said she'd hold him to that. He asked her to close her eyes. She was surprised but didn't resist. He reached up to her hair. A few minutes later he told her she could look. A beautiful hair clip with flowers had appeared behind her ear. Sasha's breath caught. He told her that her birthday was still some time away, but this was a small token of his daily gratitude to her. She promised she would always, always treasure it. For Sasha, birthdays had become something almost forgotten. Since she had married into the faux household, the original Karis had never once acknowledged hers. But this new Karis had already made himself a promise. Every single one of her birthdays from here on would have everything he could pour into it, all the love she'd been denied in the years before. Laurier spotted the hair clip and asked her mother excitedly if her father had given it to her. Sasha said yes and asked her daughter if it suited her. Laurier declared it suited her perfectly. Karis listened and privately noted that the cuteness level in this room was completely beyond what he could handle. Then Laurier turned to her father with a very serious expression and announced that when it was his birthday, they were going to throw him a big party. Sasha chimed in cheerfully that she'd do her absolute best too. Laurier was already planning to ask Garlic to teach her to bake a cake herself. For her dad, Karis was struck speechless. He managed to say he'd look forward to that day. He was certain his birthday had just become one of the most important family holidays in his life. Sasha and Laurier both looked at him with warmth and thanked him together. Karis thought it really was true that kindness would save the world. This whole birthday chapter, I don't have a lot of critical things to say about it, and I know that might seem boring, but sometimes a story just does exactly what it needs to do. The lemon cake for Sasha, because she mentioned one craving weeks ago, the stuffed animal he taught himself to sew, the hair clip slipped into her hair as a secondary gift with a quiet explanation. This man is not doing grand gestures, he's paying attention, and the pregnancy reveal landing inside the birthday preparations was genuinely good timing. The emotional momentum carries all the way through without a single beat feeling wasted. I'll just say it, I think this chapter earned its sentiment. The following day arrived. Karis sat in his office, still feeling the warmth of yesterday, working through his documents when Sai knocked and entered. He apologized for the interruption and placed a letter sealed with wax on the desk. Just arrived, he said. The man recognized the seal immediately. His parents were coming to visit. See confirmed, Mr. Oscar and Mrs. Rihanna would be arriving soon. The former Duke Oscar Foe and his wife Duchess Rihanna Foe, Karis's parents. As far as he understood, they'd been living quietly on one of their estates since retiring from public life. He couldn't think of what would prompt them to visit right now. Then he thought the pregnancy, but he hadn't told them, which narrowed his suspects considerably. He asked C directly if he had been reporting to his father and mother. C admitted they had asked him questions and he had answered them honestly. Karis was quiet for a moment. He didn't know what to expect. Sasha and Laurier and the household staff had welcomed the change in him with open arms, but his parents, who hadn't seen him in years, were a different matter. Based on old Karis's memories, his parents weren't bad people, fairly normal, as aristocrats went, but their interactions had always been colored by Karis's difficult temperament, and after the wedding had essentially been reduced to them pressuring him about heirs. He'd made excuses, work, incompatibility, anything. The truth was simpler. The original Karis had been avoidant of women in general, Sasha included. The marriage had happened only because his parents pushed for it. Laurier existed because they had pushed for an heir. That was the depth of coldness the household had been built on, and now out of nowhere there was a second child on the way. He didn't need a prophet to imagine his parents' faces. He turned to C and asked, what did he think their reaction would be when they saw him now? C smiled quietly and said, honestly, they would probably be moved to tears. Karis sat with that. Could it be that simply loving your wife and daughter would elicit that kind of response? He told Z to prepare everything for his parents' arrival and then dismissed him. He wanted to talk to Sasha and Laurier first. He gathered the family and told them. Sasha was surprised that his parents were coming. Karis suspected C had filled them in on everything and said so. He turned to Laurier with a gentle smile and told her she'd only met them once in her life, at her birth, so she probably didn't remember them. She guessed they were her father's parents. He said yes, her grandparents. Sasha smiled and told Laurier she should always call them Grandma and Grandpa. Then she turned to her husband with a worried look and said she'd at least like to prepare properly for their arrival. But Karis immediately stopped her. She couldn't overexert herself right now. She said she felt awkward just lying in bed while guests arrived. He told her no, it was their responsibility, not hers. He looked to Laurier for backup, and Laurier announced happily that she was just glad to be with her mother. Karis thought telling Sasha not to worry was basically the same as saying nothing. He looked at her and said gently, Right now she was doing the most important work of all, carrying their new family member. He was doing everything in his power for her, for Laurier, and for this baby. He touched her belly, which had grown noticeably. He said helping each other was simply what family meant. She said she was always causing him so much trouble. He took her hand and looked at her directly. Where she was concerned, the concept of trouble didn't exist. And even if it did, he'd accept it gladly. Sasha's eyes went wide. She started to say something. He kissed her on the forehead and she went quiet. He added, if she kept saying such sweet things, he'd have to silence her with a grown-up kiss. Did she understand? She turned bright red and told him to stop. Then Laurier looked up at both of them with curious eyes and asked what a grown-up kiss was. Karis turned red. He told her it didn't mean anything and to please forget he said it. He would need to watch his language. Time passed. His parents' arrival day came. He organized everything with C and advanced rooms in the West Wing, daily cleaning running smoothly the garden in order at that moment. Karis and Laurier were having tea together, and his daughter turned to him with her cup and asked what her grandma and grandpa were like. Everything he knew about them came from the other Karis' memories. He didn't truly know them, but he found the words. He told her they were very kind and noble people. She said she thought they must be just as kind as her father. He was touched by that, by the fact that his little girl thought of him as the standard for kindness. He told her that was exactly right. He looked at his reflection in the surface of his tea and smiled. He told her he didn't know how kind he actually was, but that her grandfather was an outstanding man who always put family first. And he himself was striving to be someone who put Laurier, her mother, and everyone in this house above everything else. The girl told him warmly that he was very kind. He thanked her. A maid approached to announce that Mr. Oscar and Mrs. Rihanna had arrived. He immediately suggested they go meet them. Laurier waved her arms and ran. He greeted his parents warmly and remarked on how long it had been. His mother replied the same, adding that she was glad to see him in good health, but both of them looked visibly thrown off. He smiled and said he was glad to see them doing well too. Laurier stepped out from behind him, curtsied, and greeted them politely. Rihanna was immediately moved. She said she'd only seen the girl at her birth, that so much time had passed, that she'd grown so beautifully. Oscar was moved too. Karis turned to him and said it had been a long time. Oscar asked his son with something uncertain in his voice if it was really him. Karis kept his expression easy and said yes, of course was something the matter. His father said no, he was just surprised at how much his son's face had softened. Karis noted inwardly. The past Karis had apparently always looked at his parents like he was bracing for a confrontation. No wonder his father was in mild shock. He told him that when a man had a family, he changed. Hadn't it been the same for his father? Oscar said yes, flustered. Probably. Karis suggested they must be tired from the journey and offered to have tea brought out right away. His mother said she didn't need tea just yet. She wanted to say hello to Sasha first. As they moved through the house, Rihanna noticed Laurier was already learning to dance, asked about it, and praised her. Karis noticed how quickly his mother and Laurier had clicked. His father, meanwhile, was watching him with a quiet guardedness. Karis recalled that his mother rarely smiled as openly as she was doing now. Laurier had apparently already started melting the ice. His parents commented on how the house's decor had changed, more flowers, a warmer feeling. They praised Sasha. His father asked Karis directly how things were between him and Sasha. He answered honestly. There had been a time when he'd nearly made them both unhappy because of him, but now he loved them with his whole heart. His father still looked like he didn't quite recognize the person standing in front of him. Karis said simply, "When the person you love comes into your life, the world transforms." He asked his father about his own love story with his mother. How had things been between them? Oscar was taken aback. Then Rihanna walked over and asked sharply what they were whispering about. Karis told her honestly he'd been asking his father about their love story. He asked his mother how things had started between her and his father. Rihanna said she was simply stunned that this question was coming from her son. Karis laughed and said he'd thought their story might serve as a good example for him. He caught himself and said maybe he should ask about it another time. They approached Sasha's door. Karis knocked gently and asked if she was awake. She let them in. Rihanna told her to please stay in bed and not get up. She hadn't realized things were this serious. Sasha tried to explain that it was better than it looked. Karis asked immediately how she was feeling. She said she'd slept a little and felt much better, then apologized for receiving them in this state. Karis turned to her and told her quietly she didn't have to push herself. He would not allow that in his presence. She started to say that her father and mother had come such a long way. He leaned toward her and said he could see through her when she was forcing herself. He knew his Sasha better than anyone in the world. They could say a proper hello when she felt better. Right now her health came first. She looked like she wanted to argue. He told her if she kept being stubborn he'd have to use that thing. She immediately conceded with a small, unhappy look and lay back down. Karis apologized to his parents and asked if they'd be willing to let her rest and greet them properly a little later. His mother looked confused. He asked what was wrong. She said flustered nothing. She was just very surprised by how close her son and his wife had become. He laughed and said he'd just become more honest with himself. Privately, he knew full well his parents suspected he was lying. He told them their things had already been taken to their rooms and to let the maids know if they needed anything. Oscar said he understood. But Rihanna stared into space for a moment, then turned to Karis and asked him to step into the hallway with her. His father agreed to watch Laurier. They stepped out and closed the door. Karis started to worry. He asked if there was a problem. She said no, that wasn't it. Then she straightened up and said she'd ask directly. She looked at her son and asked firmly, "Was it true, Karis?" He went very still inside. He was being asked this question again. And just like that, the story sets up the next confrontation. I'll be honest, I'm more interested in the parents' arc than I expected to be, because they've known their son for his whole life, and what they're seeing now is a man who they cannot reconcile with any version of him they remember. That gap between the Karis we raised and whoever this is has to be unnerving in a way that Sasha and Laurier could never fully appreciate. They only knew the cold version for a few years. His parents knew him for a lifetime. So when Rihanna pulls him into the hallway and asks, "Is it true, Karis?" she's not asking about one small change. She's asking about all of it. And whatever he tells her, I don't think any answer is going to be simple. I'm curious what the story does with that. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.